Friends, good evening. I'm so pleased that you are with us. Welcome to Congregation Emanu. I'm delighted to be able to share this evening with you. My name is Oren Hayon. I'm one of the rabbis here at Congregation Emanu. I'm so pleased and so honored that we have the chance to offer this program this evening in partnership with the Kinder Institute. I also want to welcome those of our friends who are joining virtually, who are a part of this evening's live stream tonight and are joining us in cyberspace from various points around our city, and I understand maybe around the country as well. A note about the flow and the format of this evening's talk. We will have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the presentation, so I urge you to take a few minutes to do some thinking if you want to jot down your thoughts on your phone or something like that. But please do silence it so it doesn't disrupt our presentation. That would be very helpful. For those of you that are joining on social media, you can ask questions in the chat field of the stream. We'll do our best to monitor those here from the Proler Chapel and answer them as we're able to as they come up. It is a particular pleasure for me to know that our congregation is hosting this evening's presentation, not only because as Houstonians, like everyone else in this room, our congregation and its members were affected by Harvey and its devastation, but to me more significantly because this congregation asserts itself as a place that plays a significant role in the moral biography of Houston. And if Houston has something like a moral biography, then Hurricane Harvey must be understood to have been one of those significant turning points in the plot of that story that changes the outcomes and the stories that follow it and affect the lives and the courses of the lives of all the people that live through it. This is also a place that always prioritizes the opportunity to become involved with those minds that are contributing positively to the intellectual fabric of this city. So I'm especially delighted that in furtherance of that goal, we have the opportunity to partner with Bill and to partner with the Kinder Institute more generally. I want to remind you about another upcoming date of a event just a few weeks from now. We will be co-hosting another event with the Emma Lazarus chapter of Hadassah. That's going to be on Thursday, October 11th at 7. That event will feature Harris County Judge Ed Emmett and Harris County Flood Control District Meteorologist Jeff Lindner. That's Thursday, October 11th at 7 p.m. That evening, our two speakers will provide an intimate look at the way our county communicates during an event such as Harvey, and will analyze the way the impact from an event like Harvey means for the way we operate during the future and in subsequent weather events that impact our area. Judge Emmett, I know, will also spend some time talking about what residents of Harris County can expect after the results of the bond election come in and the way that our area will become equipped, hopefully, to better handle large amounts of rainfall in the future. Again, we'd love for you to RSVP to let us know that we can expect you. You can RSVP open online at emmanuelhouston.org. And now I have the opportunity to introduce our speaker this evening, for whom I have great admiration and a wonderfully valuable growing friendship. Bill Fulton has served as the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University since 2014. He is a former mayor of Ventura, California, and director of planning and economic development for the city of San Diego. In his long and impressive career, Bill has also served as Vice President for Policy at Smart Growth America, as a principal in the California-based urban planning firm now known as PlaceWorks, and a senior fellow at the Saul Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. He's the founding editor and the publisher of California Planning and Development Report and the author of 5 books, including the most recent one, Talk City, A Chronicle of Political Life in an All-American Town. I am both personally and professionally, morally and intellectually delighted that Bill is here with us this evening. Would you please help me welcome Bill Fulton?
Thank you, Rabbi, and good evening, everybody. It is a distinct pleasure to be here. I am very privileged to be here knowing, as the Rabbi said, the role that this congregation plays in sort of the moral evolution of this city, which, as he said, really interplayed with Harvey a lot. We are 3 days, well, first of all, no, let me start. You're probably wondering why there's not a picture of a flood there. I'll get to that. We are 3 days away from the first anniversary of Harvey. It affected all of us in profound ways. And we at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research is an urban think tank at Rice that evolved out of the Houston area survey, which has been produced for 35 years, almost 40 years, by Steve Kleinberg, professor at Rice and longtime friend to this congregation. Later, the Institute was generously endowed by Rich and Nancy Kinder, who are leading philanthropists here in town and have contributed to the Museum of Fine Arts, to Buffalo Bayou, and the High School of Visual and Performing Arts and other things. We at the Kinder Institute started working on Harvey the day it happened. Our blogger, Leah Binkovitz, who's in the back of the room right now, there she is, actually escaped back to Minnesota, where she's from, and immediately began blogging from there all about what was going on at Rice and at Harvey, and she did come back before too long. But we started working immediately on trying to understand what happened, what Harvey did, what happened to people's lives. We were privileged as well in the first few months to do a considerable amount of research for the Hurricane Harvey Relief Fund, which was set up by Judge Emmett and Mayor Turner to try to assess the impact. I can tell you that Harvey was indeed an equal opportunity flood. People across the income spectrum and across geographies were affected pretty significantly. And I can tell you, one thing I do want to tell you before I launch into my regular talk is that people and households and communities of neighborhoods have bounced back at different rates, depending in large part on their own economic circumstances. And there are many, particularly folks in middle to lower income neighborhoods in this city, who are still living with damage, living with mold, living under arduous circumstances even today, a year later. I can talk more about that if you'd like. You know, there are so many aspects to Harvey, you could talk about it in different ways. I want to talk about how we flood-proof the city in a more intelligent and profound way than we did before. And I'm an urban planner by training, and so I tend to think about how things are arranged on the landscape, right? And how that affects the way people live their everyday lives. You know, like, for example, a completely unrelated example, today I was editing a report about where people live and where they work in Houston and how that affects commuting and how that affects people's lives. So that's how I look at the world, and I think one of the things we have seen in the wake of Harvey is a renewed interest in how the city functions on a day-to-day basis, not just how it drains water, but how people live their lives and how all those things interact. And, you know, traditionally, the reason I put this slide up here and the reason I called this talk Engineering City in Transition is because my talk here is really not so much about Harvey, but it's about the city of Houston and how the city of Houston deals with disasters and is able to build everyday lives for people that are safe and that can be safer in the future. So I call it an engineering city because Houston, like many American cities, the way the city developed, which of course created the landscape for Hurricane Harvey and for the Tax Day flood and the Memorial Day flood and Allison and all that, is driven by the way we lay out our city. And Houston's urban form has always been driven by engineering. This is a great, right here, this is a typical example. And actually, I didn't know this before I moved to Houston because I'm not an engineer, so I didn't realize this. But there are more engineers in Houston than there are in any other city in the world. That's a good thing and a bad thing, right? There are more petroleum engineers certainly in Houston than there are anywhere else in the world. There are more engineers with white shirts and skinny little ties in Houston than anywhere else in the world, right? And although there are not more, there are a lot of civil engineers, and those are the ones who have primarily worked over the decades to try to make Houston a flood-proof and a safe place. Engineering culture transformed Houston from this. How many of you have ever just seen a map just of the bayous without anything else superimposed on it? This is the natural landscape of Houston. This is what it looks like if you strip everything else out. This is what natural Houston looks like. It's east-west with the bayous. So engineering culture, in order to facilitate daily life for all of us and millions of other people over the last 100 or so years, transformed Houston from this to this. Right? When you think of Houston on a map, you think of the rectangles of freeways. You think of the Loop and the Beltway and the Grand Parkway, right? You don't think of this. You think of this, right? And so in building this, we've had to try to resist this and hold it back rather than trying to incorporate it, celebrate it, figure out how to manage it, okay? One of the things that many people have said is that instead of trying to find ways to live with the water, we have instead tried to find ways to live against it, to push it away. And as I'll get back to, that's a really hard thing to do in a city like Houston, right? So engineering culture transformed Houston from this to this. There are many, 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 many benefits to that that we enjoy every day, but partly that's what led to this, to Hurricane Harvey and its predecessors. Now, I'm not an engineer, and I'm going to, I want to point out, I'm not an engineer. When we get to the question and answer period, somebody's going to ask me about their house, or somebody's going to ask me about some particular engineering diversion on Brays Bayou that hasn't been built yet, right? And I'm not going to have the answer, just so you know. I'm not going to have the answer. But what I can say with confidence, having consulted with a lot of engineers over the last year, and particularly participating in an organization called the Greater Houston Flood Mitigation Consortium, which I've been involved with other researchers and engineers from all over the Houston area, is that this was a singular event. This was a singular event. This is the map of the rainfall. 5 days. Starting on August 25th, 2017. 5 days. The darker the color, the more rain. The darkest color represents 40 to 50. The darkest color represents 40 to 50 inches of rain in a 5-day period. 40 to 50 inches of rain in a 5-day period. How many people know what our average rainfall per year is? It's about 50 inches. So we got an entire year of rainfall in less than a week. We didn't get it in 7 days or 6 days, and then we rested. We got it in 5 days. And then we all went out to restaurants once they opened up again, right? That's pretty much what happened, which I think is appropriate. But you can see it was 40 to 50 inches here, over inside the loop, 30 to 35 to 40 inches. One interesting thing you'll note is that the places where it flooded the worst were not the same places where you got the most rainfall, right? And that's because sheer rainfall is not going to cause a flooding problem. But there is an interaction, I want to say, between the way we have built the city and the flood risk, and that's one thing we have to deal with. So, for example, this is I-610 and I-45 at Little White Oak Bayou. I can assure you, if you're not an engineer, this is a really beautiful piece of engineering, okay? This is a gorgeous piece of engineering. It is very complicated, it was very expensive, it's very big, and it serves us all on a daily basis. But it also causes problems that we don't often think about. This is a map. I hope you can see the dark blue, right? That's the floodplain. Okay? This is the same location, only looking at it from the sky. That's the same interchange, I-45 and I-610. And what you see is north and northwest of the interchange is where the floodplain is. And why? That's because the floodplain isn't naturally occurring. The floodplain is concentrated because the water flowing down Little Oak Bayou can't get past the interchange because the culverts are very small, right? So I think the point I want to make here is the way we build our city affects how we flood. And when I get to Brays, and I am going to get to Brays in a little while, because you can't come to a congregation in this town and not talk about Brays Bayou, right? I think you'll see some similar points, but the fundamental point I want to make is that everything we do in this city to build this city and to create what we have created here affects how we flood in some way and affects the flow of water. And traditionally what we've tried to do is build up an engineering infrastructure to stave the water off so that we can build in the city all the things that we need, instead of trying to figure out how they can work together. So the question is, this actually is Brays Bayou, but the question is, how much do we focus on traditional engineering solutions? How much do we focus on what is sometimes called green infrastructure? That is to say, parks, bioswales, detention basins. This is actually, anybody know where this is? No? This is Houston's first green street. This is Bagby in Midtown. And as you can see, there are bioswales and so forth that help retain the water in order before it goes away. And there's a fundamentally different approach between this and this. Okay, see how there's a concrete channel here? This is Brays Bayou, but it's not natural, right? There's a concrete channel, and that's because the traditional civil engineering approach to flooding, which most civil engineers have said is not sufficient or not enough, is to actually get the water out of your neighborhood and down into the bayou and as far away as possible and down into the bay as fast as possible. That's the traditional engineering approach. Get that water out of here as fast as possible. That's why after Harvey, some people suggested building 2 gigantic tunnels underneath the city, right? You get the water into the tunnels, they go down to the bay, it's gone. Well, when you have a lot of rain and you get the water into the bayou as fast as you can, guess what? The bayou floods. And that's what has happened as a result of the traditional engineering approach here in Houston. This approach is different. This approach says, no, wait a minute, you actually want to do the opposite of moving the water fast. You want to slow it down. And you want to make sure that the water seeps into the ground slowly and as close to where it falls as possible. That's what detention basins are for. That's what bioswales are for. That's what this kind of green infrastructure is for. So in addition to this, and this is very important, you also have to do this. That's something that we, generally in the United States, but more specifically in Houston, we have not paid very much attention to traditionally. Also, we've not even done enough of this. I mean, yes, the flood control district, traditionally, they've had about $60 million a year to stave off flooding in Houston. I mean, does that sound like that's going to work? So you have to do a variety of approaches. And then the last thing you have to do, and I'm from California, so I'm not afraid to use the word regulation on occasion, which is not something that people in Houston like to talk about, is you do have to regulate where development goes and what it looks like, right? There was a great deal of controversy after Harvey when the city council adopted new floodplain regulations, and they made a requirement that new development has to be 2 feet above freeboard, 2 feet above the 500-year floodplain, where the water, which means doesn't necessarily mean it looks like this, although there are some houses on Braeswood that look like this right now. And I was suggesting to the rabbi earlier that perhaps we just take the whole temple and we put it 10 feet up, and then this gentleman here said, well, you can park your boats underneath it then, right? Waiting for the next flood. But it's not a good idea to build in some places, and in other places we do have to build up. That requires government regulation. So you've got to have traditional engineering solutions. You've got to have green infrastructure or more natural solutions that absorb the water, and you've got to have regulations that keep people out of harm's way. That's first message I have for you tonight. The second message is to try to quickly challenge a few ideas and to bring a few things to the table just so you understand. First of all, a conclusion that we've come to at the Greater Houston Flood Mitigation Consortium over the last year is Houston floods, okay? So to have the goal be that Houston never floods or nothing ever floods is an unrealistic goal. It's an unrealistic goal. Houston floods. The question is, where does it flood? And how does that affect people and their possessions and their property? So the goal is not to stop Houston from flooding. The goal is to protect people and their property and to keep people out of harm's way. So for example, and this happened again starting on Monday I was up in the Montrose district around Allen Parkway, and it was raining. It rained for really hard for about half an hour on Monday, maybe an hour, and Allen Parkway started to flood, and everybody got all upset that Allen Parkway was flooded again. Well, the fact of the matter is Allen Parkway is designed to flood. Allen Parkway is designed to be an overflow flooding basin, you might say, so that houses in that area do not flood, and so that businesses in that area do not flood. Now, KHOU got flooded in Harvey, and they've moved, so that iconic symbol is not going to be there anymore. But that's a good example of using a piece of transportation infrastructure to double as a piece of flood control infrastructure. So it floods 5 or 7 days a year or whatever. Well, you're mad on those 5 or 7 days, but lots of people's houses aren't flooded. The second thing that I want to point out is that traditional floodplain mapping in Houston doesn't really work. I'm going to go back to this floodplain map. This is going to semi-contradict something I just said, but I think it's still important to point out. How many of you grew up, say, I don't know, in a place where there were a lot of hills, the Northeast or the Rockies? Raise your hands really high. Okay. So flooding's pretty predictable in a place like that. I grew up in the Northeast, and I grew up in a river town, right? And you know, flooding's pretty obvious. Here's the river, here's the gully. When it rains, the water flows down and it overflows the banks, right? Well, in Houston, because it's so flat, right, a lot of the flooding occurs in kind of sheet flow across wide areas. And it's really, really, really hard to predict. Now, we all think in terms of floodplain as if, oh, I'm in the floodplain, so I'm in danger, so I need flood insurance. Or if I'm not in the floodplain, I'm fine. I'll never flood. Well, do you know what percentage of the flooding in Harvey occurred outside of all mapped floodplains? It was about 40%. About 40% of all flooding in Harvey occurred outside of any mapped floodplain, right? And I think what that shows is it's really hard to predict where flooding is going to occur. Rain events are all different, and probably makes a lot more sense to think about flooding in terms of what is the level of the risk, right? What is the level of the risk? Is the level of risk low? Is it moderate? Is it high? Not, here's the floodplain and here's not the floodplain, and if you're in the floodplain, you're screwed, and if you're outside of the floodplain, you're fine, right? Which is kind of the way people think. Floodplains are mapped primarily for the purposes of the federal National Flood Insurance Program. They have to do it based on this model from other parts of the country. It doesn't really work here. So it's much better, and we've talked a lot about trying to transition to a situation where we talk more about what, not are you in the floodplain or not, but what is the level of risk. And I'll tell you one more thing, which is that that once that information is available, it has to be readily available to any home buyer, so that they themselves can assess the risk. And I'll be honest with you that hasn't always been the case in the past, right? People who want to sell you houses have not always wanted to talk too much about how much flood risk there really is. A couple of other things. There's a lot of talk about a third reservoir. Addicks and Barker actually do well in a kind of a moderate flood. They did not do well in Harvey. There are a variety of discussions for another reservoir. Well, a third reservoir isn't going to solve all problems, and a lot of it depends on who you're trying to protect, and I can talk more about that if you want. And finally, buyouts of existing homes, conserving land, regulating the type of development that can occur are really important parts of this community and watershed planning. You have to think about the big picture. And when I get to Braze in a minute, I'll talk a little bit about that. So again, flooding's going to occur. It's a question of how do you minimize the damage. You got to think about flood risk, not flood plains. There's no magic bullet to solve this problem, whether it's a third reservoir or something else. And I'm an urban planner, so naturally I think this, but broader community planning efforts that bring buyouts and land conservation and other tools into place are really important. I thought I'd talk a little bit about Braze since I'm here, and I know many people in the Jewish community were affected by Braze. And for these slides, I owe a great debt to Phil Bedient, who is the Herman Brown Professor of Engineering at Rice, and probably knows more about Braze Bayou than any other living human being. He provided me some of these. This is just a map showing Braze. There's a couple of things I want to show you. Just to give you an idea about the floodplain situation, this is a map of the 100-year floodplain for Braze Bayou. That's what inundation looks like at the 100-year floodplain, which is 100 years means there's a 1 in 100 chance in any given year that there will be that level of flooding. That's what that looks like. The 500-year flood map, which is that there's a 1 in 500 chance that you'll get this level of rain in any given year, looks like that. So traditional floodplain mapping, this is what the 100-year floodplain looks like in Braze. This is what the 500-year floodplain looks like in Braze. That's what Harvey looked like in Braze. That's what Harvey looked like in Braze. It was really, Braze gets whacked more than any other bayou. And just to give you an idea of what the level of impact that is, and I actually think I have a typo or a bad, something that looks bad on the next slide, just to warn you. Oh no, it came out okay. This is all the floodplains in Braze since 2001. This is all the flood claims on Braze since 2001. Now, I want to say a couple more things about Braze Bayou as an example. One is that there is a lot of attention being paid to Braze. Many of you know that the Corps of Engineers has a big Braze project. There's about 40 or 50 different components to it. I don't know what those all are, but this is kind of an interesting chart. This is the 5 most populous bayous in Houston, and the blue bar is the percentage of Houston's population that it lives in that bayou watershed. The orange bar is the percentage of damage from Harvey that bayou received. So you can see Braze is the largest combination of populous and had a lot of damage. The grayish or brownish bar is the percentage of all the funding for future flood control projects, both local and federal, that are assigned to that bayou. So Braze gets lots of attention. Braze has a lot of people. It gets a lot of damage. It also has more money slated for it than any other bayou. But the whole Army Corps project for Braze has gone slower than expected. Originally, they expected to complete it in 2014. That would have been perfect in retrospect. But now they say sometime in the early 2020s. And I will say, in that $2.5 billion flood bond, there's about $100 million or more. A lot of these projects require local match, and there's $100 million or more in local match. But I want to show you, since I'm a land use planner, to what is to me the most striking maps of Braze, which looks like this. This is the land use within Braze Bayou in 1970 and 2010. And you can see that in 1970, the whole western half of Braze Bayou watershed was not developed. The whole western half of Braze Bayou watershed was not developed. By 2010, it was basically all developed. It was basically all developed. And much of it was developed without much consideration for downstream flooding, right? So when I asked Phil Beatty, how do you fix Braze Bayou, he says, you buy up all the car dealerships on the west side of the loop, and you just punch a bunch of holes in the parking lots and create detention basins. That's an oversimplification, but it's not much of a one, right? That all this development and all this impervious surface has led to all this really rapid runoff into Braze, which is part of the problem. And then you see that, and then you see this is just a map of some of the projects that would be part of Project Braze. I want to make a couple of other points before I close, particularly in thinking about Braze, because there's been and I want to go back to community planning for a minute. There's been a lot of discussion post-Harvey about buying out houses, right? And you've seen all kinds of things. The Flood Control District has a list of 3,000 or 5,000 houses they want to buy out. You've seen a variety of blue sky possibilities for Braze, where you might buy out the first couple rows of houses. I mean, I understand as a member of this congregation that this is an existential crisis for the Jewish community in Houston, because all of the infrastructure of the Jewish community is threatened by flooding on Braze, right? And so there are very difficult decisions that have to be made by the Jewish community about whether those institutions stay there or they go somewhere else. And if they go somewhere else, what does that do to the cohesiveness of the Jewish community in Houston? That's, as I say, an existential issue for the Jewish community, which we're going to have to face up to. And I think that's going to be a very, very difficult set of decisions. But what I will say is that the worst thing we could do is buy out scattershot lots and scattershot and checkerboard pieces of property. Because one of the things I believe in as an urban planner is the value of neighborhood and community level planning, where people come together and decide together how their community is going to grow and what it's going to look like. I was on a tour some months ago. We brought in some buyout experts from around the country, and we took them on a tour, and I cannot remember where we were. We were either in Independence Heights, I think it was Independence Heights, or possibly it was Kashmir Gardens, two neighborhoods, two relatively low-income, mostly African-American neighborhoods that got really hammered by Harvey. And there was one place I saw where originally there had been there was the freeway, and right next to it was a park, and originally the neighborhood had been right next to the park, right? Now, what had happened was flood control had come along, and they wanted to put in a detention basin to protect the neighborhood. So they ripped out the first couple of rows of houses, and they plopped down a detention basin, which, in engineering terms, is not a bad idea. But think about it now. You've got a park next to a freeway separated from the neighborhood it serves by a detention basin, right? In other words, nobody went back and rethought, if we make these changes, if we put in a detention basin, if we buy these houses out, what should this neighborhood look like in the end? That is something that has been lacking in the discussion, and frankly has been often lacking in Houston generally. And I think one of the most important things we can do as we move forward, and the city is going to get $1 billion from the Department of Housing and Community Development, or Housing and Urban Development, to work on housing-related issues associated with Harvey. I think one of the most important things we can do is be intentional and conscious about how we reshape these neighborhoods when these difficult decisions have to be made, so that those neighborhoods are at least as good or maybe better as they were before. So that's part of my message to you about engineering city in transition, is the engineering is just as important as ever. We have to build many of these engineering projects, and that's why the flood bond is necessary. But we also have to think about the people and the community and the neighborhoods and what these neighborhoods look like if we reshape them, and how they can still serve the communities that they have served traditionally, only in a more flood-proofed way. So thanks very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have, either those of you in the room or those of you live streaming.
Hands up, and Jason's going to come around with a microphone. If you've got a question, just be patient, and Jason will do his best to find you and get to you with the mic.
Could you repeat the name of the person you said has studied Brays Bayou intensely? You said that he knew the most about...
I'm sorry, could I...
The person's name that you said had studied Brays Bayou...
Who studied Brays Bayou? There's an engineering professor at Rice named Philip Bedient, B-E-D-I-E-N-T. He runs the Speed Center, SSPEED. I can't remember what all that stands for. But he spent his entire career studying Brays Bayou and knows as much about it as anyone alive, I'm pretty confident. No, I was just saying the guy in the back got the mic, but we'll get to you in a minute.
Okay. First of all, thanks for coming in. I think you bring up a good point about Brays Bayou. I was driving by the Metro park and ride there. The course is at 610 and Braeswood there. Are we in active discussions? Is the city or the county or some combination thereof, or perhaps your consortium, are we in active discussions about it seems like that would be, as you said, like a natural place to put a reservoir or a retention rather than a concrete park and ride.
That's a good question, and I don't remember specifically where the detention basins on Brays are proposed to be, but I will say this. Many of you may recall that the Houston Parks Board came out a couple of years ago with a plan called Bayou Greenways 2020, where it was a plan to green all of the bayous, primarily for recreational purposes. An ancillary to that, an add-on to that now is called Beyond the Bayous, which seeks to create greenways that connect everything all over the place, all over the region. And I do know the utility corridors in that area are on the list. So I think it's a combination of, as I say, I don't specifically remember where the detention basins in Brays are supposed to go, but I do think that the flood control district can and is working closely with the Houston Parks Board to make sure that green space, particularly in Brays, has multiple benefits. And I know there's a lot of discussion about Gulfton and so forth with that. Yes, sir. We promised we would call on you, so.
There's a bond issue now.
Yeah.
In the billions, is that correct?
It's $2.5 billion.
$2.5 billion.
It's about a 1% increase in your property tax.
Does the planning associated with the bond issue address the things you talked about here? The green space, the impact on neighborhoods, and the major points you made.
There are most of the money is for engineering projects. There's a considerable amount of money for buyouts. But I think probably what will happen is that the flood control district will work collaboratively. I know they're working collaboratively with other county agencies, and probably will do the same with the city housing department and the Parks Board to try to make sure that those upfront planning considerations are taken into account as that money is spent and as those projects are designed. I'm not against the bond. I think the bond is absolutely essential. I also think all of the agencies have to work together to make sure we get, as I say, multiple benefits and get green solutions as well as engineering solutions.
I was wondering if you could possibly elaborate on what you mean by green infrastructure. I know you said that incorporating that more into the city instead of trying to build against the water could help, as in letting the water sink into the ground more, moving it more slowly than trying to get it out as fast as we can. But how does that look when we have something like Harvey, when the water just can't absorb into the ground fast enough? Like, what exactly are you advocating? What?
Right. So what happens when you have 40 inches of rain and getting the water into the ground slowly isn't going to work? That's when you have to do, I think that's when you have to do both, right? The water will, and that's when you have to have detention basins or Ellen Parkways that allow you to take a lot of flooding for a short period of time while it drains and seeps into the ground. That's my best answer for you. As I say, I'm not an engineer. I don't have all the solutions for you.
Okay, so just like get it clear, you're advocating more for like a combination of traditional and
Yeah,
green engineering.
right, a combination. I don't, like I say, I don't think we can, I think the engineering solutions are vital, and we have more engineering chops in this town than in anywhere in the world, but I also think that we need a balanced approach with other solutions.
There's a number of organizations, including a number at Rice, and I'm familiar with some of them because I know BDNet and Blackburn and others.
Yeah.
And a bunch of organizations outside of Rice and various county organizations, departments and city departments and God knows who else, kind of studying the plan. And I'm just wondering, I think some of them are saying the same thing, some of them are not. How do you see this sort of coming together in some sort of cohesive effort, if I can use that term, and how long do you think it might take?
Well, the thing we've learned, so we've tried to learn lessons from Katrina, and we also tried to learn lessons from the Sandy storm in New York. And the thing, two things. One is, it is very difficult to get all of the agencies working together. I mean, we're going to have a situation where the flood control district is going to have $2.5 billion. The city and county housing departments are going to have $1 billion each. The Army Corps is going to come in with several $1 billion. And by the way, in case you hadn't noticed, TxDOT is going to redesign I-45 north of downtown, and that's going to be several billion more dollars, including that exact area where I was talking about. Ideally, all of those, there should be a minuet among all of those agencies where they all bring their billions to the table and they work together to try to, find the optimum solutions. The thing we learned, particularly from Sandy, is that's really hard to do. Sandy was, one giant city and two giant states, right? And they weren't all moving in the same direction. That requires a lot of both political and civic leadership. And you're right that Jim Blackburn has been very articulate in being out front, both supporting the bond and also supporting the kinds of things I'm talking about. But it's going to require an enormous effort at political coordination on the part of the mayor, the judge, and the agencies to get that right.
Bill, we have a question that came from someone who's watching
Yeah.
on Facebook who asks about the political viability of some of these different solutions. Obviously, there's a whole other layer of this conversation about whether, when it comes time to handing out the dollars, whether some, rather than other, of these solutions are more politically expedient to those who are elected to serve us. Is all of this kind of talking into the wind? Is it hopeless for us to talk about this?
I don't think so. I think there's been, the needle's been moved considerably by Harvey, right? I can remember before Harvey, I went to a meeting where there were a bunch of, and we were talking about flooding risk, and there were a bunch of civil engineers who had worked for many decades in Houston, and they said, well, you can solve the problem very simply, just give us $1 billion a year forever, right? And I suppose that would work, right? Because that's a lot more money than we've been putting at it. I think we are at the point in history, though, where we realize that we cannot throw money at something and do only one thing with it. Right, we have to do lots of things. We have to do lots of things together. I am hopeful that these agencies can coordinate. So just to give you a quick example, city housing department's going to get a lot of money to renovate housing, to move housing. Flood control district's going to get a lot of money to improve drainage in the channels. What you would hope is somebody decides if you tear down an apartment building here, you find the money to build it and make it affordable over here, right? Then they all work together. That's the kind of thing I know that the city housing department is talking about. And that's why I say these issues are really not just about flooding, they're about city building. Somebody said not long ago, it was Henk Ovink, who's from the Netherlands. The Dutch, whenever there's a flood, the Dutch show up. It just happens. And Hank said, don't plan for a disaster, plan for the future. And I think that's partly what I'm trying to say here.
You have one in the back.
Sorry, I'm going to ask a somewhat engineering question. The space that you mentioned, Midtown, the green space, how does it accomplish drainage? Houston is known for clay soil. It doesn't absorb any water at all, and it gets worse as you go deeper and deeper.
Right, that's an engineering question. I don't know the details. There are soils that take it down underneath the street. I warned you that I didn't know the answers to those questions.
I was just wondering about new development and if there are rules to help make new development be greener and
Yes.
and also to have it make it so that it's not.
Yeah, new development has to be net zero runoff, right? So in other words, it can't make the runoff situation any worse than it is when it starts. I was out this morning in the energy corridor at a panel discussion with the West Houston Association, and there was a guy on the panel who is a much more politically conservative guy than me, who said there ought to be a net deficit. In other words, new development ought to make the situation better rather than just keeping it the same. And I think we're going to see ourselves moving in that direction.
Jason, you got one over there.
I may not really know enough to be asking this question, but inside the loop, they had finished a lot of the Brays Bayou project and widening, and they flooded real bad too. So how do we know that they're doing the right thing?
Not all of most of the Brays project was not. First of all, most of the Brays project, a lot of the Brays project wasn't built. And secondly, I don't think they ever advertised that it would. Again, this goes back to a question of risk, right? What's the risk? Well, the risk is higher when there's 40 inches of rain. So I think we have to have confidence that they have it pretty well. Brays has been studied more than any other bayou, and I think that we have to have confidence that they've got the engineering part of it pretty much figured out. I think that the challenge is what do you do with the areas that are still at risk, which are right along the bayou, and as I say, many of which are the respected institutions of the Jewish community. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Josh Fixler. I'm one of the rabbis here. And it seems to me one of the challenges that we face is that individual communities can work on protecting themselves, and that actually has a negative effect on communities downstream or other communities. I'm wondering, in your background in urban planning and community planning, are there tools and strategies for trying to get those communities in conversation with each other to try and build solutions that are helpful not just to you, but to your neighbors downstream?
That's a good question. Very rabbinical, right? Communities should be talking to each other, right? In conversation with one another. I think new communities, of course, are built not by the people who will live in them, but by developers. And that is why I think the rules the developers play by, particularly upstream, are the most important things. But I do think one of the things that Harvey did was it brought us together more. And there was a tremendous, one of the things Harvey did was it revealed the cleavages in this town between the middle and upper income neighborhoods and the lower income and working class neighborhoods, which have had such struggle coming back. And I think there's a much greater awareness of that cleavage and a much greater interest on everyone's part in making sure that those neighborhoods of where people of modest means live come out of this okay.
Outside of voting for the bond Saturday, do you have any encouraging words for citizens or what we can do to help with all this?
What you can do to help?
With, this is making me very anxious. When I think, will the agencies work together? Will we move forward? Is there anything that a citizen can do?
Well, I would say talk to your elected officials, particularly your county commissioners, whoever your county commissioner is, and encourage them to get have the agencies work together. Most of those agencies are under the control of frankly, the flood control district is under the control of the county commissioners, not the mayor. And I think that is where the political pressure point probably is. But there's nothing like listening, like hearing from. I used to be an elected official. Believe me, you listen to your constituents, or should, more than you listen to anybody else.
Bill, on the slide with the bar chart, were there other, are there other bayous that are deserving of perhaps more money than's going to be allocated to them?
No, no. There's a bunch more bayous that are not on this chart that have less population, but they don't have more money. They don't have more money assigned to them than Braze.
What about the fourth one?
Buffalo had more flooding than Braze, but Buffalo's also bigger, and Braze had more. Braze has lots more people, and of course Buffalo is partly protected by Addicks and Barker. That's where that damage comes from, right? Yeah, and affected downtown. Although downtown came out okay, you know. In fact, I think some of the office space, some of the companies have begun to rethink the energy corridor versus downtown as a result of Harvey, because the energy corridor got whacked and downtown did fine.
Here, we're in a situation where now every 60 to 180 days, Congress is running around to try and renew the flood insurance program. The government's taken over that program. You know, I've heard discussion that, you know, we need to try and get private sector back in. You start to get the insurance companies involved, you'll start to get some insurance risk. But we're going to get into a position where people aren't going to be able to get mortgages because they're not going to be able to get flood insurance.
Well, and this is where I think, in part, information in the real estate market about the risk becomes really important, right? Because the private insurance companies can't manage that risk if they don't understand it, which is why, and the National Flood Insurance Program has always had the wrong incentives, right? You know, I mean, the idea was to provide cheap flood insurance to people who are at risk for flooding, right? No wonder it's bankrupt. So I think you have to get the feds have to get the pricing signals right, and then the real estate market has to get the risk signals right for the privates to come back in. I'm not really an expert in insurance, but that's my take on it.
All right, I think we have another time for another one here. Yep.
Yes, if the city can offer bajillions of dollars in tax incentives for a company like Amazon to come and locate here, why can't it offer some kind of tax incentive to developers to develop in a way or in places that are going to be more helpful in terms of flow?
So I'm sorry, I didn't hear the whole question. If the city can offer economic development incentives for somebody like Amazon, what's the question?
Why not to developers to develop in a way that is more more flood resistant?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's a it's a whole different subject. You know, a few years ago, the New York Times did an analysis of economic development incentives in the country and said that state and local governments were spending $80 billion a year on economic development incentives, and it didn't seem to particularly be generating much economic development in the net. I think that what the city did in the case of Amazon was they felt like they had to play the game with everybody else, right? And the city was rather embarrassed. We were the largest city in the country that did not get past round one with Amazon. But I think your point is well taken, that the city does have financial resources to throw at certain kinds of development. And the question is, what are they going to try to get out of developers in response to that, right? So oftentimes, I was talking a minute ago about the possibility of having new development create a net reduction in runoff, right? Well, that's going to cost money. Well, the first thing developers are going to say is that's not our problem, right? We shouldn't pay for that. Somebody else should pay for that. So then or TxDOT saying, remember that interchange? TxDOT saying, our only responsibility is to maintain the current crappy situation. Right? We're going to completely rebuild I-45, and our only responsibility is make sure that that miserable floodplain map is the same as it is afterwards as it is before. Well, so that doesn't mean they can't improve it. That means they don't want to pay for it, right? So I think your point is very well taken, that there are economic incentives the city gives to developers, and we have to have a very strong conversation in this town, which we've never had, about what does the city get in return for those.
Okay, well, I have a follow-up question, and that has to do with eminent domain, because it's often said that, the city and the county has very few tools to regulate development, but they do have the power of eminent domain, and they could use some of those flood bond funds, for instance, to buy up undeveloped land that we need preserved for.
Yes, they could do that. The flood control district is more likely to use eminent domain to buy property that they're actually going to build a facility on, like a detention basin. And I don't know Texas law well enough to know whether you could buy you could take property by eminent domain in order for it to remain in its natural state. I would think that's a pretty controversial proposition, but I take your point.
All right, we're going to do one last one, and you have the last word.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned the Dutch, and the Dutch are perceived as the world's experts in this problem, and I wonder if there's something they could teach us.
What can the Dutch teach us? Well, that's a good question. We're trying to figure that out now. But I think what the Dutch can teach us is that this balanced approach I've been describing actually makes sense. The Netherlands is extremely heavily engineered, right? The Netherlands, kind of like New Orleans, is this engineering miracle every single day. And yet, in the last 30 or 40 years, the Dutch have moved much more toward green solutions as well, flooding of the fields and so forth. And so I think what we can learn from the Dutch is not just how to engineer, and in fact, the people from Rice are over in Rotterdam all the time trying to learn that, the engineering people, but also how to use the natural and the green solutions as well, because the Dutch are way out in front of everybody on that. So that is, I think, what we have to learn from the Dutch, and I hope they stick around town. I hope there's not some other flood somewhere else and they go there instead, because we're not done learning from them yet. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you all. That's about our time for tonight. Thank you, Bill, for your time. Thank you for joining us. Please come back and see us on the 11th for our program with Judge Emmett. Thank you all. Have a safe drive home.